Luminary presents Therapy versus the World. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and today I'm very, very excited to share this episode of a conversation I had with Matthias Barker. Matthias is a psychotherapist and the CEO and co-founder of the Trauma Institute with Dr. Frank Anderson, where they provide clinical training for psychotherapists and education for the general public on healing from trauma. He is widely recognized for his unique approach to making mental health knowledge and skills accessible to the wider public. In today's episode, Matthias and I actually disagree on something. We disagree about how the term trauma should be discussed clinically and culturally, but we do so as colleagues and we do so respectfully. And I found the conversation and dialogue to be really, really informative and engaging. I know he gave me a lot to think about. I'm still skeptical of some of his views on trauma, but I am an impressed skeptic. And I know I gave him a few things to think about as well. And so for those of you who follow me or him or both, and even if you don't, I think you're going to really learn a lot from this conversation. Check it out. Welcome. I'm very, very excited to have you.
Super grateful to be here. Thank you. Thanks for having me on, and excited to have this conversation. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Before we dive into the topic that I just mentioned, I would love to hear from your own words. Why did you become a therapist? Why content creation? Why trauma? Just for those of us who don't know you, I'd love to hear a little bit of a background, and I'll provide one as well.
Sure. Well, I graduated with my master's in counseling, not exactly sure what I wanted to specialize in. I had an internship at a place where I was working with something called maladaptive sexual behavior, which is when kids sexually abuse other kids, which was a very intense environment in a population where there was just a lot of overwhelming suffering for everyone involved. And so quickly felt pretty overwhelmed by that experience, just even as kind of a fresh clinician kind of getting into the field and not really knowing what to say or how to help. And so that kind of sent me into like this deep dive of like, I really want to help my kids. I want to help these clients. I want to help these kids who are suffering and know what I'm talking about so that they can feel better. And so I got really just almost borderline obsessive about just the neurophysiology of trauma and understanding how to treat developmental trauma and attachment trauma, and just kind of zeroed in on that topic with a lot of intensity for about, I'd say, a year and a half-ish before, almost kind of accidentally, not quite accidentally, but accidentally finding a large following on TikTok of all places. So I say accidentally because I don't know if anyone intends to kind of go viral on TikTok. I think we all just throw a video up there and hope for the best, but we don't really even know what we're in for. And then I had a couple videos just explode that I really wasn't anticipating. And it was just me recording videos just in my office in between clients or after a long day of sessions. And it was just reflections and thoughts that I had after talking to people. And it was just really grounded in my own kind of personal experience and some of the research and data that I was combing over, trying to kind of just grow as a new clinician. And so I felt like this really heavy responsibility, even more so. I felt a heavy responsibility to help these kids who were in my care, but then even more so, I got 1 million followers in 1 month off of TikTok. And I was like, what do I even do with this? And then I went to 2 million in a matter of a few months after that. And I was invited into circles, not because of my expertise, but just on virtue of having a lot of followers, and invited to speak in front of a lot of people where I didn't feel, just the ultimate imposter syndrome. Just like I just didn't feel worth the seat at the table that I was given. And so my response to that was to go grab mentorship. And so a guy named Dr. Frank Anderson, he's a lead trainer for something called Internal Family Systems. He was really active at a guy named Bessel van der Kolk's Trauma Center. So Bessel van der Kolk, for those listening, wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, pretty popular book in the trauma world. And Frank was the on-staff psychiatrist at his trauma center and was there for like 30-something years and was on the first study for EMDR, was part of the reason why EMDR is an evidence-based treatment. And I could go on and on about him, but he co-wrote the manual on IFS and just seemed like a pretty great mentor if you could just have your pick. And so me and him started collaborating on kind of creating these general public workshops and courses on how to heal from trauma. And through that collaboration, really kind of securing myself an apprenticeship, so to speak, under one of the greats. And it's been about 2 years now that I've been meeting with him every week pretty intensely, and he's been just kind of showing me the ropes, I guess. And It's been everything from him having me read books that are much too hard that I only stand probably half of, to him watching over my client sessions and line by line, like why'd you ask this question? What'd you do here? Like what, like shaping how I'm actually using these interventions in a clinical setting. And then in the background, continue to just post on social media and create content. And to be totally honest with you, that's probably been in the background in my mind, because a lot of this is really centered on me actually doing work to help people heal from trauma, both in my clinical practice, but also in some of the workshops and kind of the groups of stuff that I do. So yeah, that's a little snippet of what I'm up to, and I guess the past few years and what that evolution's looked like. Yeah. But it's culminated in Frank starting a trauma institute, and he's asked me to kind of help him execute that. And so I get to wear the fancy title of CEO of the Trauma Institute, which feels a little bit weird, but it's more so, I guess, kind of enacting his vision to continue to bring that trauma healing to the world, and gather scholars, scholars, teachers, founders, people all together to have those conversations. What does it look like to heal? So I'm really happy to get to be a fly on the wall in those conversations. Pretty great.
Absolutely. Well, from the rest of us from the outside, it makes perfect sense why you're doing what you're doing and where you are. And something that I've always very admired about your content, and particularly, is, I have different personalities, different ways of expressing ourselves, and it's not, one is better than the other, but it was more just, I find that when it comes to relationships of all sorts, whether it's a romantic relationship or a partnership or just a friendship or just someone I like their energy, there is that phenomenon of like, oh, they have something that I don't have, and I like it. I want to be near it. There's something wonderful about that. And the way you integrate this unmistakable warmth, I would almost describe it as, but with the intellect, is something that I very much enjoy from your content. Before, I want to reflect some parts of my own story back to you based on what you've said. But before I do that, like today or recently, how do you balance the clinical work that you're doing with the media work? Is it kind of half and half? Is one more than the other?
Well, so I think that's fluctuated over time. Where it's currently at is I'm assisting a guy named David Kessler. So he's one of the main guys doing work on grief right now. Do you know about the stages of grief, like denial, acceptance, bargaining? Mm-hmm. So he wrote that book. He's that guy. Right. Him and a woman named Kubler-Ross wrote a book on grief and kind of brought it into the popular sphere. She had a TV show back in the day where she kind of gave people skills for the first time on how to cope and process and understand grief. And so David has been running these grief groups for years, and several times a week, we'll essentially kind of gather a group of like 100, 200 people. And it's not therapy, but it's something like support. Because, grief isn't a mental illness. Like, it can become complex, and then it needs mental health treatment in some cases. But it's a stage of life that we're all going to go through. And so he provides these grief groups kind of in larger settings. And he's been training me on essentially kind of leading and facilitating some of these groups. And so this is a long way to answer the question, but I would say I have one day a week where I'm doing trauma therapy, and I'm training in EMDR right now, as well as using IFS under Frank. And so I do a lot of that work with clients on Tuesdays, and then on other days of the week, I'm leading these groups with David. And so that's kind of my workup. So I'd say it's probably part-time clinical work, part-time content creation, speaking, writing, all the stuff I'm sure you're busy doing as well. So how have you worked that balance in your calendar? Are you doing more and more content stuff? Or are you still having a full client load? What are you up to?
The cadence of my week is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are pretty full clinically, all outpatient, mostly individuals. I would love to facilitate a group. I was talking to a colleague about maybe joining a private practice here in New York City just to do some more group work, because I miss it and I haven't really done it since grad school.
Dude. Yeah.
And it's the best, arguably. And Thursdays, I wake up, I actually go to my own therapy, and then I'm kind of in content mode until dinner time. Thursday is kind of my content day, whether it's a podcast episode or meetings or brainstorming or filming or whatever it might be. That just seems to work best for my schedule and me. I kind of get into that mode. And then Fridays, it's kind of a mix. We can do makeup sessions. We can shoot some more content. If there were other takes that we needed, there can be a recording. Today's Friday and we're talking, whatever it might be. And I do try to respect the weekends for self-care and just considerations around all of that as well. But it's also so part of my story is I kind of, like you, it was almost kind of an accident, and but it's very intentional right now. And so depending on what's going on, I really do feel like let's put the gas pedal to the floor and actually learn this trade in a lot of ways, like this trade of
it's
media.
It's a whole other skill set. Yeah, totally.
Oh, totally. It's not something I really saw for myself. So for me, you ever see that show Billions?
No. What's Billions?
On Showtime. So it's based off of this like hedge fund, I think, in New York. And there's this psychiatrist, Dr. Wendy Rhodes, and she keeps all the finance bros super like grounded and finely tuned. So nothing is messing with their ability to make trades. And I had the good fortune when I was 23 years old to meet a real life version of her. It wasn't, I think she's based on a real person. It wasn't literally her, but a performance coach, a clinical psychologist. She had her organizational PhD, and we met on a startup together. And for whatever reason, she just took a liking to me. And I don't know if anyone who's listening, if you had the great fortune of finding someone to kind of mentor and coach you when you were fresh out of school, but you basically just do everything they say. You worship the ground they walk on because you're so naive and helpless because you're 22, 23. Like, what do you know about business or about life? And they tell you what you're good at and what you're not good at and how to get better. And that watching her be with people in more kind of corporate, like there was some experiences with her doing more like group work, like kind of corporate retreat, like coaching type stuff. But I saw how effective she was. And I knew that no matter what I wanted to do, I wanted to work with people. And so I was like, I'm going to follow you around, and just learn everything I can. And that experience ultimately culminated in me getting my master's in clinical counseling. I always thought I would continue to follow in her footsteps and do something with more kind of corporate applications or more business applications. And then when I was in the middle of my internship in grad school, COVID hit. And we all got moved online, and everyone that I was seeing in person, we were now in the office. And a lot of change happened that year from a variety of kind of cultural and political and all these different facets of our world. But for me, the one thing I noticed, well, number one, mental health was already a crisis before. It was already important before, and it just became way more important.
That's right.
And two, the waiting list for the practice that I had my internship at was already long. It like tripled in length. There actually just wasn't enough practitioners. And I believe, unlike Katie, who I referred to earlier, unlike Katie, I really enjoyed the clinical work. I think that she got something else out of it. And so for me, I was like, you know what? When I leave school, I'm going to do private practice. And I actually almost went to law school. I love private practice. And for me, there was this feeling of not being able to help enough people. And I mean, totally honest, not being able to make enough money.
Yeah.
Like and if you stop working, you stop making money. And that's the downside of a fee for service business. And so I thought, well, what if I take some of my political and policy interests and advocate for the profession? But then last minute, I decided not to go. I just focused on building my practice and getting supervision and everything you do after you graduate. And then I kind of looked at PhD programs. It doesn't really make any sense. I don't really have the temperament to be a researcher. I'm now learning in hindsight, but it was still an exploration. And then there were people in my life who started to say the most interesting thing to me. They started to say, why don't you make content? And I was like, dude, because cringe. Are you kidding me? Like, I do not want to do that. And I was feeling a little bit adrift on what else to do besides the standard clinical work. And when enough people in your life suggest that you're good at something, you try it. And so it was April 17th of last year, I posted my first video, and it was something like, 5 reasons you should go to therapy, or like, I don't know, whatever hook was like trending at the time, or like whatever. But it was my 14th video. It was actually about metacognition. And the video was something like, you don't have to listen to everything you think. It doesn't always come from a deeper place. You can actually learn to let that thought go. And this is what Freud thought, and this is what Beck thought. And, do you have any questions about this? And at the time, I don't even think I had 500 followers. I think most of them were probably friends and family. And before that video fell off the algorithm, it got like 1 million views.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, what? Like, it was just so...
it's an existential
it was just so
shit.
mind-blowing to me.
It's wild.
Yeah. It's really, really wild. And I remember the way I've explained it is, let's say if 1% of the people that saw that video the first time it was posted, let's say if 1% of them, that really helped them, like no one ever said to them that not every thought needs to be very deeply analyzed, which is essentially the takeaway. That's 10,000 people. That's more people than I could treat in several lifetimes of a career, just doing full clinical casework. And so, not that it's a replacement for therapy, because it's not, but that doesn't mean it can't help people and it can't impact people. And so
That's right.
I stopped cringing. I started getting a little more serious about it. And I started absorbing a lot of mental health and self-help content. And one of the ways I guess I'm known, at least from what I can discern from my comments in my community, is that people love the fresh take that I can bring. And sometimes it's very critical, sometimes it's very curious. And I started noticing that people were using terms, in my opinion, inappropriately and imprecisely. And it wasn't even the first video on trauma that I made was like the really famous one. It was just another one where I was just like, oh, I do not like this take very much. You need to be careful of phrasing like this. And when the Cult of Trauma video happened, it got, I think it's something almost like 6 million views or whatever it is. And the really incredible part for me watching that happen was it wasn't just my engagement in my community. I started seeing other content creators would either make stitches, sometimes criticizing my take or supporting it. Or the other thing that I thought was so interesting is even creators who don't follow me would start to do takes similar to mine about trauma, like kind of like philosophically similar. And I just know they were looking at like what's trending, or maybe they were working with a strategist or whoever it was, and it was like, oh, like what this guy did works really well. And so then they start making their videos, and you see like the conversation shift. And I believe that's why they call it being an influencer, because there was that, to watch that influence. And in some ways I wasn't even like prepared to like watch it like go like that far. And I don't know if it's me just reading into tea leaves, but I know that there's certain accounts who I was previously critical of them before. They have changed their verbiage. They have said this might be a trauma response. And so I don't know if I should necessarily take responsibility for that, but being in the public square that social media is and affecting that conversation was really, like, as you said, it's a paradigm shift. It's like, what's happening? How many people have seen my mustache? I'm really confused, and I don't want to sound self-deprecating or like I'm not working at it, because I am, but every once in a while there is this moment of like, how did I get here? Like this was never the intention. So
I'm excited for you. I think you bring a really, like you said, I agree with you, a unique and fresh take. And I think you're speaking honestly, and in many ways you're speaking against the grain of what's kind of popular in pop psych right now. And I respect that. I think I respect your courage to just say how things are really appearing to you and how they're occurring to you. And I think there's a lot of people who are just kind of, I don't know, a little bit intimidated to go against the popular grain, especially some of the larger creators out there. I've seen that you've created, ideas criticizing not people, but ideas, like against some of the larger creators. And like, good, like people need pushback from credible, thoughtful people. And this furthers the conversation, because, we can't fall into some sort of dogmatism that isn't grounded in the evidence, what's genuinely the experience of people, So I think that you're doing a service to the community. So I'm thankful you're doing what you're up to.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. I want to let's dive into that, into the different perspectives. And what I would highlight, something I didn't say about my story, is I think a big reason why I don't just feel comfortable doing that, but feel that it's necessary, is my undergraduate training. It's liberal arts. I went to Wesleyan University, but the major combined history, economics, political science, and philosophy. But it was incredibly like kind of social theory based. And so I think that for me, I immediately noticed, maybe compared to other practitioners or other people who are really involved in conversation around mental health, I took a kind of a cultural studies lens to it, and a knowledge of political philosophy and rhetoric, and just like all these different things, and just noticed the different nuances that were there that people weren't necessarily talking about. And within that, I would say that, I think that there's some of my content I would say is very clinical. It's very mental health based, but a lot of it, to your point, it's about the idea, and it's actually a cultural challenge.
Yeah,
it's like, is this really how we should be talking about this as a collective? And it always tickles me when someone comments, like, how could you possibly, talk to a patient like that? And I always laugh,
Well,
and it's almost kind of a painful sigh, because it's kind of like, well, I was actually had a very trauma-informed education. I actually I've not done the EMDR training yet. It's kind of on my wish list, but I love the somatic techniques are really like my bread and butter, clinically speaking, and I just see how effective it can be. And so, anyways, with all that said, maybe the way to do this is maybe I will describe to you what I think the problem is, and then we can just kind of get into the back and forth.
That sounds great to me. Go ahead.
And so I was trained psychodynamically. And so for those of you who don't know, who are listening, what that basically means is that my primary training focused on, well, how does the past affect the present? It's kind of modern day Freud is one way to think about it. And it could be childhood implications, but you could also have worthwhile psychodynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis from something that happened to you in adulthood, and maybe you're now in mid-adulthood or whatever it was. And one of the things that I first noticed when I started absorbing content, and one of the reasons why I made that first viral video, is I was kind of like, well, where are all the cognitive practitioners? Where are all the kind of like the true behaviorists? And maybe it was just what the algorithm was feeding me, but that was kind of my first like, oh, well, don't people know that there's another way to look at this? And when I started seeing videos that would say different things like, well, your personality is just a trauma response, or this happened because of trauma. For me, one of the reasons I had an immediate reaction to that is because one of the things that I learned from my first weeks in grad school, my practicum and internship, was there's a difference between the problems of living and what we would call mental illness or mental disorder. You brought up grief earlier, and I think that's a really excellent example of it. Everyone experiences grief, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know, but it's something that everybody experiences. And I think for me, part of my story, and I've touched on this on other episodes, I lost my dad at 11, and you could make up all sorts of, things about like how that affects me, or how it affected me, or how it maybe birthed an interest in mental health and why I'm doing what I'm doing. But I know from my experience and from having lots of therapy that there was a trauma conversation, and then there was a grief conversation.
Yeah.
And to label it, losing a parent is, of course, going to be traumatic. Of course, there's going to be grief. And of course, it's adverse in a lot of ways. To label it all as trauma, I think for me, actually it's unnecessarily like monochromatic. It actually loses a lot of stuff that was important for me to process and think about and feel. That my concern is that as the word trauma has become more in vogue, that people are actually missing out on that opportunity. And so I would say that is probably where, like, that's probably my most personal reason. And then probably more just temperamentally with my personality, I'm a very like logical guy. And from the Big Five perspective, I think I just talked about this on another episode, but I'm incredibly compassionate, but I'm not very polite. And the Big Five defines politeness as kind of deferring to norms and authority. And so I think that also maybe explains a little bit why I was like, nope, I don't agree with this. And I don't feel too much guilt or shame doing it. And it really is, the last thing I'll say is, I think it's maybe easy to catch like a segment of one of my short form videos, or, maybe read people in the comment sections, and people sometimes have this takeaway that this is, it's just to like for the algorithm, or it's like just to get attention or something. It's like, no, it's a genuine and authentic concern, and it's a concern like based out of love for the profession. Most people that are learning primarily about mental health through being in therapy or being on social media aren't necessarily present to the kind of more philosophical debates that our field has around, well, how much do we medicalize normal life experience? How much, how do we weigh systemic responsibility with individual? How much do we, do this and this? And so my intention is not even to get everyone to agree with me, but to realize that there's a debate, because we actually know that there's a debate around policy, around the law, around medicine. The average person knows that there are different perspectives. And because mental health is so new and on the scene, my hope is that I can be one of the voices that helps people realize that there is a lot of nuance and there are different ways of looking at things. And so I think I'll pause there. That's probably a pretty good summary of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, well put. So just to summarize a finer point there. So you would say that trauma is something that really should be reserved for discussing symptomatology connected to PTSD. And would you go that far, or would you change that definition?
I think that, yes, and I think that there needs to be some sort of what would I call it? Like a semantic integrity, like around like the definition of the word. I don't know if buy into is the right way to say it. I buy into the complex trauma diagnosis. I've seen it clinically. I've seen how the treatments work. And so I don't necessarily think that it needs to be as rigid as like I'm not a DSM hardliner. I would say that you can have PTSD, you can have big T and little t traumas, you can have complex trauma, but that doesn't mean that the definition of what trauma is should necessarily be so broad to encapsulate any negative experience that has impacted you.
Yeah,
I think that there is a meaningful difference potentially.
Do you feel the same way about the word anxious?
I do. The words anxious and depressed are the first examples of what we call kind of concept creep. I'm very excited to interview in a week or two here Dr. Nicholas Haslam, who coined that term. He's based out of Australia, and I'm really excited because he also studies stigma, and so I'm very excited to get his
I don't know him, but
this
that's
conversation. Cool. But the idea, for those who listening that don't know, the concept creep is basically this idea that kind of harm-based definitions start to slowly expand to encapsulate more and more things. And so for me, personally, I take the stance that if we're going to speak of anxiety, we should speak on a fixated preoccupation with something terrible that might happen. If what you're feeling is nervous or anticipatory or vigilant, there are many words in the English language and other languages that can still fit that experience. It seems to be, when I think about using depressed to mean I'm feeling like tired or low mood, or using anxious to mean I feel nervous, there seems to me to be less of a risk of some cultural implications of that. Because when we speak about trauma, we start speaking about our past, our stories, our relationships, and we're not necessarily trying to communicate a mood in this moment. And so I would say I still do feel that way about those terms. And I mean, listen, let's also just say it's difficult. It's not like when I'm out with friends, I don't ever, say hyperbolically something about trauma, or it's like that was super depressing. Like I do that as well. And we weren't using these words and talking about these things so openly even 5 years ago. No. It's a very, very new cultural shift.
Yeah. I think those are meaningful distinctions. I think the reason I ask about the word anxious is because we could use that to speak of an anxiety disorder. And then we could use that to speak about a very normal human experience that people that don't have mental illness also experience. And, there's a lot of variety about how to build these semantic categories around the word trauma, especially in the past 5 years, because it's kind of entered the cultural zeitgeist, so to speak about suffering, which is really what I think on a broader level we're talking about. What does it mean to suffer? And then what does it mean to experience a wound that's just normal, about being on this earth? Like you're just going to experience suffering to a degree. That's not a disorder to experience suffering, because that's part of the plan. That's the existence of being a human on the planet. But then when does it become disordered? The suffering, I don't know. I like to think of the analogy of what does it mean to be wounded versus that wound to get infected? And then it's not just I got injured. It's like the injury itself maybe is even a bigger problem than the original thing that nicked me in the first place. That's a good question. So that's where I think some of these semantic conversations need to happen, and we need to be precise in how we use these words, whether it's something like anxious and anxiety disorder, or that was traumatic, or I'm wrestling with trauma, or that was rooted in trauma, or I'm having a trauma response. And when we're talking specifically about something like a flashback, or like something that's more endemic of a PTSD diagnosis. So that's where I think the categories of little t, uppercase T trauma tried to smooth that over. Was like, well, what if there's like little traumas and big traumas? But the threshold for that isn't obvious. Because it's like, are only the people who've been like abused or went to war, are they allowed to say they were traumatized?
Right.
Or can someone who, I don't know, got in a car accident and then can't sleep, and every time they try to get in a car, they start having a panic attack? Like, is that trauma? Like, because those feel like totally different things, like a car accident and, experiencing molestation. So these are all important semantic categories to pin down. You look like you have a thought on the top of your mind.
Yeah, I do. Well, I'm curious to know what you think about this. It's something I've explored with my videos, with my community, and also a lot of writing that I've been doing, which is the semantic difference between like that was traumatic versus I'm having the trauma response, specifically in the context of we know two people can get into the same car accident. One has very severe PTSD. One walks away a little shaken, but fine. People come back from war zones, and then you get into the little t trauma category, and it's something around a certain style of parenting, like inconsistent caregiving. Two children in the same home. I'm just imagining twins, even just for the sake of argument. One ends up developing something resembling complex trauma. Let's say one is fine, and so how do you understand that, not just clinically, but also how do you think about that, and like how can we take that clinical understanding and then improve or more deeply understand the trauma discourse that we're having in a way that is net positive for everything?
Well, I'll tell you where I land, and I don't know if it's the right place to land, but this is where I land currently, and it's contingent as neuroscience is continuing to evolve and as we're understanding this better. But I take a behaviorist lens because, like you just pointed out, it's not obvious we can start to rate different experiences on a scale of traumatic or not traumatic, because two people can get out of the same car and someone has, PTSD, someone doesn't. And these studies have been done, like on the first responders to 9/11, for example. They looked at folks who developed PTSD and who didn't a year later, and they did, pretty big interviews to find out, like, well, what was it? Because everyone pulled the bodies out of the rubble, so who got PTSD and who didn't. And they found that the strongest predictor for PTSD was having gone through something traumatic in your past. So for folks who grew up with, a father who was violent towards them or with an alcoholic mother, like they were more likely to develop PTSD after 9/11. And so it's like the state of the organism when it experiences the adversity is actually pretty salient. It's like we have to look at not just the environmental impact, but also the biological impact, how the environment expressed or didn't express various genes that change how someone responds to trauma. Like, this isn't simple. It can be highly complex. But so here's where I pin myself down, because we can't just get lost in the ambiguity of like, oh, there's so many factors, what do we do? Is I say that any sufficiently overwhelming experience that produces a self-reinforcing, maladaptive coping mechanism can be accurately described as trauma. I'll say that again, just for folks listening. Any sufficiently overwhelming experience that produces a self-reinforcing, maladaptive, meaning negative, coping mechanism can rightly be described as trauma. And here's why I place it on a behavioral front. That's where I've decided to put my pin down, was on the behavior. Because when someone experiences something that's overwhelming, so threat response comes in through the thalamus, there's connections and memories being formed in the lateral amygdala. You have these threat responses that are not conscious. We're not thinking about it. We're not deciding how threatening it feels to us. It's just innately happening within subcortical structures. You have associations that are formed, and those associations and memories that are formed in those lower brain regions, again, that we don't have control over, are visceral and connected to responses, coping mechanisms that, again, are not necessarily within our volition. To put all that psychobabble onto an example for a second would be like, if a baby cries when mom walks away at night, that terror of, is mom ever going to come back, is not something the baby's deciding whether or not they want to experience. They reach out and they experience the cold night. They're alone. They feel threat. that threat is creating an association that this dark void is something I am uncomfortable with. It doesn't resemble the safety of being nestled in my, in my mom's arms. And I'm crying out, and I'm feeling heightened threat. So an association is formed with the darkness. The kid doesn't want to go to bed because bed means I'm away from mom, and so they cry out. Now here's the catch. It's like, it's not enough to say, well, that's just an overwhelming experience. Any overwhelming experience is trauma, but it has to create a negative, self-reinforcing coping mechanism. So the baby cries, mom comes and soothes. That's a healthy coping mechanism. It's an adequate response to the environment to then, trigger the environment to satiate a need. Good. Crying is a great coping mechanism for a kid who needs, to settle down after being put down. They're good and fine. So the kid isn't traumatized. Now, the kid does not receive care, cries out. Mom doesn't come. What we know from observing, young children and actually having in the lab what happens when you kind of let a kid cry it out, so to speak, is muscle tension starts to flow through the neck and up to the, you could go all the way up to kind of the brainstem, the cerebellum, kind of all the way down. There's like this tension that goes down the neck muscles, down through the chest, because the kid doesn't have fine motor function over their fingers or toes or whatever. You see this heightened tensity, and then this heightened blood pressure spike, and then you see the heart rate get, faster and faster, and then actually start to calm down, and then you see this shift out of something like hyperarousal, which is that tension, into the freeze state, into hypoarousal, which is you get this flood of hormones and neurochemicals that inhibit the crying and inhibit all of the external gestures of please mom, come, and that would be something like feeling numb, and that association is formed in the brain. Lots of cortisol. We know that is an overwhelming experience for the child that they are not equipped to be able to handle. And so they cope with it in the best way they know how. Now, the argument is like, well, is that adaptive? In the moment, yeah, that is adaptive. They kind of numb because it's an overwhelming experience, so their body just kind of shuts down. Now, if that's prolonged, let's say that's a pattern of behavior over the child's experience growing up, like not just at nighttime, but when they fall down and hit their knee, mom doesn't come running. When they, when they're hungry and they're crying because they're hungry, mom doesn't give them food. And they just kind of get into the progressive habit of, if I have a need, if I'm overwhelmed, I don't reach out. I shut down. I don't call out for mom and dad. I'm just essentially maybe something like self-sufficient or just disconnected from the signals that my body gives me that I'm hungry or tired or in fear. And so that child grows up with that self-reinforcing coping mechanism that made sense on that Tuesday night, but extrapolated out and, repeated over the course of one's life starts to actually create some problems of its own. And then you talk to this woman or man, when they're married and they're trying to enjoy intimacy with their partner and they're like in a chronic people pleaser, like I'll do anything for you, but they don't know how to open up about their own needs. They don't know how to open up about what they want. They don't know how to talk about what's, important to them. They haven't paid attention to that since the crib. And, that might be a little hyperbolic. I'm sure there's like subtle things that they pick out one t-shirt over another because they like the color or whatever. But there is let's say in a measured difference in their ability to tune into their own needs compared to the general population because of something traumatic that they experienced as a kid. And the function of that was that that trauma created a cycle of self-reinforcing coping that ultimately kind of became a problem in and of itself. So I'll do a different example. Let's say someone's socially anxious. They walk into a party and they don't want to look awkward. They don't want to look weird. And so they just look at their feet and they try not to make eye contact with anyone because every time they make eye contact with someone, they kind of feel nervous and they kind of feel nauseous and whatever. And then they're in a conversation with someone and they're talking and they're thinking, am I coming off weird? What am I doing with my hands? Like, what should I put my hands in my pockets? And they're not listening to the other person. Now, in that conversation with someone else, they're going to come off awkward. They're going to come off strange. They're going to come off a little disconnected. Not because, well, they were particularly awkward going in. It's because the way they were trying to cope with their fear of coming off awkward actually made them come off awkward. So it's self-reinforcing. Here's the weird part is the person walks away from the interaction and just goes, yep, I knew I was awkward. I knew I was an idiot. Like, yeah, they don't want to talk to me. Who would want to talk to me? I'm just so pathetic. They have essentially attribution error. And the cognitivists have tuned into this. The behaviorists this is a modality universal observation that when people get trapped in attribution error, it cycles, it oscillates into behaviors that become a problem in and of itself. And the case that I make is that that started somewhere. There was a time when that behavior was adaptive in a limited context, and then that got reinforced over and over again into something that was not adaptive for the new context. And the guy or girl is not learning because it's self-reinforcing. They think I'm just lame and stupid. That's why they don't like me at the party. They're not realizing they need to listen in the conversation, listen to the other person, stop focusing on their hands and pay attention. So there's all of that in the air. That's why I tie it down to behavior. And so just to summarize that one more time, any sufficiently overwhelming experience that produces a self-reinforcing maladaptive coping mechanism can be classified as trauma. Maladaptive can be defined as something that produces irrational, self-reinforcing pliance. That's a word from relational frame theory. It just means like compliance, like I'm just following my mental rules instead of paying attention to the environment. And that can be in contrast to an adverse experience. But here's my thing about adverse experiences, and this is where I disagree with a lot of the folks who are coming after trauma being too broad a term. I'm like, an adverse experience should be something that you're sufficiently resourced to respond to. If I'm tired chopping wood and I choose to keep chopping wood even though I'm suffering, I'm not traumatized by that because I'm resourced to put in some grit and keep chopping wood and put a Band-Aid on my blister and keep going. Like, I can push myself into states of suffering if I'm adequately resourced to respond in an adaptive way. But if I'm chopping wood because I'm a pathetic piece of garbage, and if I can't get this whole, thing, this whole court chopped, then what kind of man am I? That, I'm going to argue, is a trauma response in the sense that that's likely rooted in some experience that you have not updated yet. There's something lodged in there. You're acting not in relation to the environment, but in relation to some old experience that you haven't updated. And that's consistent with the API model and EMDR. That's consistent with most trauma therapies in that kind of Bessel-van der Kolk camp and all the philosophies that come out of that world. And so that's what I hold to. And I think what that does is it keeps intact a neurobiological basis for calling all these different things trauma. It does distinguish between adverse and traumatic experiences. And it gives us a practical, like, what do we do with this? When we're calling everything trauma, what do we do? I think it actually gives us a bit of a roadmap for what to do about that. So curious about your thoughts. I went on a big TED talk there, but what do you think?
Totally. No, I mean, I love listening to you talk, and I took a few notes of things I want to specifically reply to. I really love how thoughtful and nuanced the definition is that you present. I want to throw out a couple of examples so you can either refine the definition or double down or make exceptions or really whatever comes up. I'm curious to know your thoughts.
Sure.
So the first is this idea of something was adaptive or made sense then. It no longer makes sense now. Let's say with the social anxiety example that you used. Well, maybe I am a college student and I know a way to get approval from my peers is to be really fun and be really funny and behave in a certain way. And I go about doing that, and I continue that behavior after college into adulthood. And over time, little by little, I start to kind of even unconsciously pick up on this, on noticing that some people aren't super pleased with that behavior. What really worked for me then to make me feel like I was socially gelling with my community isn't working for me now. And in a way that you just described, there ends up being this kind of self-reinforcement and this self-fulfilling prophecy. And eventually, before I know it, I've developed something like social anxiety or social anxiety disorder. And now here I am. And hey, therapy can be very helpful with that. Now, that in itself is not necessarily a traumatic event or a traumatic response, but it still has to do with a lot of the same mechanisms that you spoke to. And so could you say a few things about what the exceptions might be? Because there's a lot of parallels right there. It's something from the past, it's was adaptive and now it's maladaptive. I'm not necessarily resourced to handle what's happening now for whatever reason. How might you take that example to help us clarify a precise definition of trauma?
Well, let's say, I'm not a supervisor. I'm not licensed to be a supervisor. But let's say that you were a therapist coming to me, telling me about your client, and we were like, oh, what are we doing here? I would say, oh, you don't have the case conceptualization all the way filled out. Because my question is, why didn't they adapt? Why didn't they realize that being funny worked in that past context, but you need to have a more professional tone now that you're in a different setting? What about that transition made them turn inward and then make a title about themselves that they're awkward or they can't do it or they're just, no good? There was an what's the right way to put it? They didn't update. There was an error in updating. Mm-hmm. And so then I'm wondering, what experience in their life did they refer back to affirm the maladaptive coping mechanism? Because, for example, if we're just kind of pontificating, could be that they had a really good relationship with their mom. Mom was an alcoholic, but when they were laughing and keeping things light, things were good. And so they just kind of learned that I got to keep things light and fun and fine. Or mom was just stressed a lot of the time. And so if I kind of brought a serious, tone into the room, it would kind of feel really overwhelming to her. So I had to keep things light. Even let's say it's just 20% of that. Maybe it's not even that extreme. Let's just say it's something along those lines. That would make sense to where, the light, funny thing works in college. But then I went to, my career and it didn't work and I don't know what to do. It's well, yeah, you weren't even paying attention in college. You were just doing what you figured out worked when you were 9. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a 9-year-old was the one making jokes in college, to put it metaphorically. And so then when you got to this new environment, you were totally under-resourced because even the adaptive behavior, something can be self-reinforcing and adaptive even though someone's not tracking with why it's adaptive. So for example, someone who's compulsively washing their hands probably didn't get COVID as much as people who don't. That doesn't mean that they were compulsively washing their hands because they knew how to not get COVID. It's it just so happens that maladaptive thing worked well in that context, but that's a fluke, not because it was tracking. So that's where I think these things don't feel obvious. It's that wasn't, the social thing wasn't traumatic. I'm well, hold on, go back. We have to go earlier in the story. That's the psychogenic theory, that there's a genesis. And that, you know this with your psychodynamic training. There's a genesis to where this first began. So I'm kind of rooting that in behaviorism, as I put it.
Yeah. And listen, there might be. And in a one-on-one or even in a group therapy context, I trust you and I trust any competent practitioner to explore whether is there a childhood connection? Is it this, or is this just something you weren't aware of? Can we be a little more solution focused, et cetera? One of my concerns from the more cultural perspective is that we also know that there's a specific way we can go about probing for those questions for that psychogenic event without risking creating meaning where previously there was none, without risking stuff around kind of false memories. I'm thinking about the book Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. Are you familiar with this one?
No, I'm not. I haven't read that.
Basically, it was written by a couple of social psychologists, and essentially there's a bunch of different chapters on different things, but it's basically the way people absolve themselves of responsibility for things that they contributed to. And one of the chapters, they looked at the kind of the satanic panic and the repressed childhood memories and all of these court cases that happened. I believe it was the 80s, maybe it was
I know
90s.
Those cases. That's wild to read about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild to read about, and it's something I've talked with different supervisors about how it's not a part of our industry, I guess you call it. It's not a part of our industry's history that we really like talking about, but the fact that people would go in probably having experienced trauma with something resembling borderline personality disorder into an inpatient unit, and the type of analysis that was conducted was so harmful that they actually left even more splintered, more fractured than they were before. And so well, I guess it's two questions. One, if you care to talk about how do you go probing for that psychogenic event without risking that? And two, how can we think about the broader trauma discourse with the fact that we know that that can happen in therapy if conducted improperly? And that has been one of my concerns where, well, if I am on Instagram multiple hours a day, which many people are, and I get a lot of self-help and mental health content, and it's, trauma this, trauma that. And then I start, thinking, not in therapy, because I can't afford therapy, because I'm in a country without good mental health infrastructure, because I'm not ready to go to therapy, like whatever the reason might be. That is one of my concerns. I think that you and I are probably more aligned than not on the clinical definition and conceptualization of trauma. And I found that with other content creators, particularly ones where I either engage in the comment section or we message a little bit back and forth, whatever it might be, there's always kind of this moment of okay, yeah, for sure, but I bring up the question I do because if that could happen to some patients in an inpatient facility where and I've also seen that in my own practice where people have come to me after years of psychoanalysis that was not conducted properly, and they have these incredible implicit memories in really exquisite detail and all this meaning, and they're reacting to it completely congruently. And it's not to say that they were implanted by false memories. That's really not what I'm getting at. But I'm saying, but was that healing for you? Are we now adaptive? Are we now resourced, as you put it?
Yeah.
It's something I think about.
That's a great question. The way I answer that is, okay, what do we do with the psychogenic event? That's where the difference is. And I think what I think you're picking up on, take my opinion with a grain of salt, do whatever you want with it. But my opinion is I think that you probably, having heard what you're saying, are taking a bigger issue with what people do with the psychogenic event than the idea that there is one. So when people say, it's trauma, this is a trauma response, I would encourage you to say, it likely is, but what they're doing with that is not the right thing. What they're doing with the idea, this is a trauma response, that means I don't have responsibility for my actions. That means everything else around me has to change. I don't have to change. I'm totally valid. That means all my emotions are valid, which means all my interpretations are valid. It's weird how those get coupled together somehow. All emotions are valid. Not all interpretations are valid. And aren't emotions interpretations? That's... I don't know. I don't get it. So I'm what we do with that has to be very specific. Mm-hmm. And we're in a philosophical ground here, but I think that there's evidence-based therapies that have a common through line of what to do with that leads to healing. And the way that I outline that is there needs to be a witness of the experience of the traumatic event, whatever it was. And the experience of that isn't just the storyline of what happened. That's where people get stuck. People come in and they just kind of rant about how bitter and awful their mom was or something. And not that that's not that they're wrong or that people don't have bitter, awful moms, but that's not the thing that heals. It's what was it like for you to be raised by a bitter mom?
Yeah.
That's the content that matters. Then he beat me and it did. Okay, but what was it like for you when they told you that they wanted you out of the house because you were going to marry someone of a different race and that you were betraying the family? That's what I want to know. And people want to get really caught up on the blame that goes to their perpetrators or unduly defending their perpetrators, kind of falling on their swords, so to speak. But both of those are beside the point. It's what was it like for you to experience that? What were the thoughts, the feelings, and the sensations that came from that? And then and EMDR goes here. What does that experience mean about you? Mm-hmm. That's the crux. That's what needs healed.
Yeah.
This experience means that I'm powerless and da 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 da. Okay. That's the maladaptive whatever that needs to be fixed. Of course you would have marital issues. Of course you'd keep floating around jobs. Of course you'd have trouble with the addiction if you believe that you're just a helpless, pathetic piece of garbage. Yeah. I know, just speaking personally, so much of my issues that I've had, that I feel like, oh, I just need more willpower, I just need to try harder, were often rooted in just a bunch of shame. That when that was relieved and I found healing just in that concept of how I view myself, moving towards my values and actually like pursuing things that are meaningful to me, even with a lot of struggle and adversity, became a lot easier to me. I mean, James Clear says as much. He says like you need to have a change in identity, not just a change in, direction.
Yeah.
And so I'm like,
being.
yeah, take that all the way down. Like that's the harm of trauma, is even the baby in the crib, like it didn't have the cognition at that developmental age, but it certainly developed into a cognition, something like I'm just not worthy, I'm just not desired, I'm not loved. Like that's what neglect, something's wrong with me. And that's the fuel that turns into something bad. So that has to be witnessed, that has to be transformed and confronted. And not just on a mental, logical level. You have to have an experience that transforms that. You have to witness the truth in the world or in relationship, in a way that's compelling to you. And then there has to be a release of that.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's what allows you to take responsibility for your life and allows you to move into being the kind of mature, resourced person that you kind of already are. Like that's another place I disagree with a lot of people. It's like, well, if they were just more resourced, they'd be better. I'm like, they likely are resourced. Like when you meet traumatized people, they're incredibly capable. Like, that's something that a lot of people don't know. I'm like, gosh, like this person will compulsively run, marathon after marathon, even though they have like bloody toes. Like that takes a lot of grit. There's not like a lack of ability in there. There's just a maladaptive coping mechanism that's being self-reinforced, that it's like they're sitting in a cage that's unlocked.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I approach that.
Yeah. One last question before we wrap up here. I wish we had a whole other hour because
I feel like we just got started.
Things.
Yeah.
So we'll have to continue it no matter what. But the question is, have you seen? They were recent. There were some viral videos showing of the baby hits the head, and then the really concerned reaction, the baby starts to cry. Versus it's like, oh, oopsie, haha, like, and then the baby just laughs. Same event. One is crying, one is not. And the different creators that I've seen do commentary on this have connected it to the trauma discourse. And they have used it to, they're all probably asserting different things. My takeaway was that, how we talk about in the terminology we've been using in this conversation, like how we talk about or the immediate story that comes after that psychogenic event or whatever it might be is really, really matters.
Yeah.
And so from a cultural perspective, how do you think about that? Because one of my concerns about the destigmatization around discussing trauma, which overall I support wholeheartedly, is, the more normalized this becomes, and anything that creates, your definition of trauma, anything that results in this is, I do wonder if we're towing on the line of disempowering people from the start. And it's really, really difficult. I want to hear what you're about to say, but I also want to include that it's such a tricky topic because even in entertaining that question, there's this risk of like, but we also don't want to disempower the people that are able to finally talk about and own what happened to them. And I believe
the question is what gives you power.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The question is what gives someone power. And my answer to that is the truth.
Beautiful. Agreed.
And so if the truth is that what you're doing has a psychogenic root in something that happened to you, you need to get to the truth. The truth is what sets you free.
Totally.
It's always been that. It's never been anything different throughout all of history. It's always been the truth sets you free.
Yeah.
And so the truth, I think, needs to be at the center of all the practice. That's why I think there's so many responses of once you, like I'm saying, I don't know if the error is in calling it trauma. I think the error is then our conclusions about what that means. Like,
sure,
it's trauma, then what? If it's trauma, then means I don't have to do anything. The trauma means you have to change. Like, hold on.
Yeah.
The trauma means you just got the call of adventure to go into the thrill of your life, and that's to not just scour over your history in some ambiguous way, but to get to the root of what makes you human, and then to update that and to bring all of you back to the present moment, because all of you should be here. There's so much beauty and goodness right in the present in front of you. It would be a crime to not get to enjoy all of it and to take it all in. And anything that's stopping you from being able to drink in this beautiful, incredible life should be treated with the utmost sincerity.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I would say that specific interpretation, I think, can be applied to any misuse, intentional or not, of any psychological or mental health term. So just for example, I'm thinking about either in my life or people I've worked with where they say something like, oh, well, my trauma is activated, or, that was narcissistic, or whatever it might be. And it's like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but the way you're using this term is to actually avoid connection or avoid digging down into an uncomfortable emotion or whatever it is. And that's actually not the promise that our field is offering.
Yeah.
The promise is actually opposite of that.
That's a great way to summarize it. It's like, I don't think the problem's with the word. I think the problem is how people are using the word functionally.
Totally.
And so I'm like, and I think we could say, well, we just need to gatekeep the word. And I'm like, I just don't think people are going to pick different words. Like people, people are going to pick different words to describe their terrible interpretations of themselves or the world that's making everyone hurt more. And so I'm like, get to the heart of it. Like, people are using the word trauma to speak about everything. That's fine. I'm almost don't even really care that much. I'm like, functionally, what are you using that for? That's where I think the work is to be done, is to articulate with more clarity what healing looks like. And if that happens, then when someone's like, it's a trauma response, then we all have an intuitive notion about what that means. Not just what that means for what they're trying to describe, but the arc of healing and moving forward becomes more clear. And that's the thing that I think is ambiguous.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we have to stop there.
Yeah, sure.
Is there anything you want to leave the listeners with before we wrap up?
I know that you and I had a big heady conversation around all the beautiful intricacies of all this. And I think that ultimately this is humans' lives that we're talking about. And if anyone's listening that has been through something or has considered them, gosh, maybe there's something I'm struggling with now that is rooted in trauma, I just give you that good old pitch to find a therapist. And I don't know if it's obvious to everyone where to even start looking. My personal recommendation would be something like EMDR or internal family systems, and you're looking for someone who's EMDR certified or has a level 2 training in IFS or above. And I think that the reason I make that recommendation is you want someone who's been through some training, not just someone who's going with their best guess. And this can be tricky territory, and you want a guide who's competent to be able to walk through this with you. And so just search in those terms if you want to Google it somewhere near you. And I know that not everyone has access to mental health resources or can afford the copays or doesn't have insurance. And so that's why me and Joseph are hard at work trying to make this accessible to everybody in our own way. But I would say that the action step here would be to start that journey yourself, to get down to the truth.
Beautifully said. I really could listen to you talk all day. We'll have to wrap up, but to echo what he just said, a proper diagnosis, something like trauma or PTSD, is actually a very hopeful, because that means that you can find someone competent in treating it, and you can heal, you can evolve, you can transform, you can grow. And with that said, thank you for listening. If you're still with us, please like and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're watching this or you get your podcasts. And remember, Therapy versus the World is early and ad-free, only on Luminary.